Hi, welcome back to the Vintage Model Company YouTube channel. In this video I'm going to show you how to assemble the new Balsa Basics Spitfire. This Spitfire is for beginner builders and intermediate pilots. It flies fantastically with predictable stall characteristics, a wide speed envelope and very light wing loading. Let's get started. First of all, I like to lay out all of my components on the workbench. You can build this model on a normal table with no plan and just some good old standard superglue. We recommend that you get yourself some of this glue though. Rocket Hot can be used to permanently bond the airframe components together as you go by first building the subassemblies dry and then wicking the glue into the joints. It's really quite good. Links to the kit, electronics, tools and glues can be found in the description of this video. I like to pop out all of the pieces and make stacks of them to build faster later on, but you can pop out or cut out each part as you go. Starting with the fuselage, if you're using the standard motor used on the Balsa Basics Cub, which is the B or standard motor, locate the motor mount F2B and former mount F2C. If a more powerful and larger motor is being used, only use F2C. We've included these two motor mounting options so that you can use the motor of your choice. If using the standard type motor, insert the force supplied captive T-nuts to the pre-drilled holes from the rear of F2B. Alternatively, if using the larger motor, you can insert the T-nuts into the pre-drilled holes from the rear of F2C and disregard F2B entirely. Using F2C will give you more room for different motor options. Now locate plywood formers F1, F3, F4, F5, F6, F7, HF1, HF2, HF3, HF4, servo tray ST, and the two plywood front fuselage sides. Dry assemble, but do not apply glue until instructed to do so, HF3, the battery tray, onto the formers F4 and F5. Then slot HF2 onto F4 and F5. Whilst holding the parts together, place the assembly onto a plywood fuselage side, ensuring that the tabs fit into their respective slots. Slot HF4 onto HF5 with its tab locating in the slot at the top of the fuselage side. Add HF7 to the rear of HF4 as well as into the vertical slot on the fuselage side and slot HF1 into the front of F4. Add F3 locating it to the front of HF4 and to the vertical slot in the fuselage along with motor mount F2B into vertical slot B if required. And F2C into slot C, ensuring that the base of the captive nuts are facing towards the rear. Insert the servo tray ST into the horizontal slot in the fuselage side to the rear of F7. Place the second fuselage side into position, ensuring that the tabs on formers F4 to F7 and servo tray ST are correctly located in their slots. Hold the fuselage side together from F4 to the servo tray ST. Make sure that everything is square and that the fuselage sides are aligned before wicking glue into all joints and tabs. Don't apply glue to any formers forward of F4 though. When the glue has fully set, bring the fuselage sides together, ensuring that the tabs on F3 and F2B, if used, and F2C are positioned into their slots. Add former F1 to the front and clamp or tape the front together, or just use your hands. Check that everything is square and aligned and wick glue into the joints around the tabs and allow the glue to fully set before removing the clamp, tape, or just letting go with your hands. Locate F6 and stick the former to the slot on the top of HF4. The inner fuselage box is now complete. Locate the following formers F9, F8, F10 and F11 and the right and left hand fuselage sides. Dry assemble the Balsa fuselage sides to the inner box, ensuring that the left and right sides are correctly positioned. Each is marked with an L or an R. Dry assemble the formers F9 with the F facing the front and F10 into their slots, and then bring the rear of the two fuselage sides together and insert former F11. Ensure that the sides are correctly aligned with each other before wicking some glue into the rear joint and around the formers F10 and F11. At the front of the fuselage, check that the Balsa fuselage sides are correctly located on the former tabs and that they are in full contact with the plywood inner box. Wick some CA into all of the joints, tabs and along the bottom and top of where the Balsa and plywood sides meet. Locate the keel formers K2B, K3 and K4 from sheet 4. Insert K1 into the top center slots on formers F1 to F3 and stick into position. Stick K3 into the top center slots of F4 and F5. Locate keel K4 into the top center slots on F8, F9 and F10 and wick some glue into the joints to secure. Stick the 3 30-second stringers included in the kit along the fuselage formers to create the flowing turtle deck lines like so. Now we move on to the battery hatch. Find the following formers B1, B2 and B3, and also the plywood base B4 and the keel parts K2. Lay out the plywood base B4 on a couple of 3mm scrap plywood pieces removed from various formers and put them onto a flat surface. Stick former B3, B1 and B2, dry assemble the keel K2, check that they are square and correctly located into their slots before wicking some glue into the joints. Stick the stringers in much the same way as you did for the fuselage into the slots to complete the construction of the battery hatch. The hatch is designed to be held in place using 4 3mm diameter magnets. If these are being used, then insert one magnet into the fuselage former and another into the hatch former, using backing scraps of balsa to hold them in place. Stick some self-adhesive velcro tape onto the battery tray. The other piece is attached to the battery. Cut a piece of velcro battery strap to a length of 15 cm and from the top pass it through an outer slot on the battery tray and loop it round, and underneath pass it through the opposite slot. Now we move on to the electronics. You can install the electronics later in the build, as these models are designed for you to swap the electronics out from model to model, but it is easier to install them at this point while the underside of the fuselage is exposed. Mount the servos onto the servo tray from the underside of the fuselage with the servo arms fitted pointing to the centre line of the fuselage and fix in place with the supplied screws. Run the servo leads back through the central hole in the servo tray and forwards through the slot in F5. Stick the ESC with double-sided servo tape to the fuselage side between formers F3 and F4, passing the motor leads through the hole in the motor mount and the battery lead up through the battery tray. Ensure that the motor leads can be easily reached at the front to allow the motor to be connected. Screw the motor to the bulkhead captive nuts using the bolts included in the kit. At this point you can run the servo push rods for the elevator and rudder back from these servos by passing the wire through the holes in the rear fuselage formers. The receiver can be mounted now or after the fuselage has been covered. It's probably a good idea to test your electronics now just to make sure that your motor is definitely spinning the right way, which is counterclockwise when viewed from the front. If it spins the wrong way, then just switch out 2 of the bullet connectors and swap them around, and your motor will now have changed direction. Locate the 2 pieces of sheeting for the underside of the nose. Start at the nose and line up the correct part against F1. Stick the edge of the sheet to F1 and allow the glue to set. Gently wrap the sheet around the curve of the nose, a little at a time, whilst applying glue to hold it in place, and then continue until the whole of the sheet is stuck into place. Take the second sheet and stick it to the first, and allow the same procedure to stick it into place. The rear underside is covered using 4 sheet pieces, similarly to the first. Stick them in place like so. Using sandpaper to round off the edges of the underside sheeting where they meet the fuselage sides, also give the sides a gentle sanding to remove any rough edges or excess glue at the joints. The fuselage and battery hatch are now ready for covering. Make sure that you do not cover the tail mounting base, however, as you will need this to be ready for the tail plane assembly later. Talking of the tail, remove the cutouts from the horizontal stabilizer and then press the 2 replacement parts in place. This is done to strengthen the tail as the grain from the new parts run in the opposite direction. Ensure they are pressed home and flush with the tailplane's surface before wicking some glue into the joints. For the vertical stabilizer and rudder, locate the 3 rudder parts. Hold the parts in place and glue them together. Locate the 4 Balsa elevator parts and this central plywood joiner. This piece needs to have the leading edge sanded a little before it is glued in place. Glue the whole thing together by wicking CA into the joints. When building these parts on a table, it might be a good idea to use some sort of protective plastic film underneath so you don't glue the parts to the table. 4 slots for the mylar hinges need to be cut into the trailing edge of the tailplane. Use these measurements here to draw lines along the tailplane and elevator at intervals. Using the lines as a guide and using a sharp knife, carefully cut slots into the edges to a depth of approximately 13mm, keeping the knife nice and vertical to the edge to avoid the blade from cutting through the surface. Check that the mylar hinge can be inserted to about half its length. You can now repeat this process on the fin and rudder with these measurements before giving all of the tail parts a nice sanding. Bevel the trailing edges of the fin and tail planes so that the control surfaces will be able to move freely. All of these parts are now ready to cover. Please note though, do not cover the lower area of the tailplane where it sits on the fuselage, as this is where the glue needs to go to stick the sub-assembly to the fuselage mounting base. The wings are built much like the fuselage, without a plan and without glue at first. Don't add glue until instructed. First off, find the plywood main spar, ribs, spar doublers, rear spar and the leading and trailing edges. Insert ribs W2 to W11 onto the main spar on one side only. Locate one Balsa main spar doubler and carefully slot it onto the assembled ribs behind the plywood main spar. Insert the Balsa rear spar to the slots at the rear of the ribs. Find one leading edge and carefully insert it into the slots at the front of the ribs W2 to W11. Find one trailing edge piece and slot it into position at the rear of ribs W2 to W5 with the 2 tabs located in the slots in the rear spar. Find one wingtip part and assemble it onto the slot at the end of the Balsa main spar doubler and the rear spar. Find the small trailing edge piece and insert its tabs into the rear spar and into the ribs W10 and W11. Find a plywood servo tray and, while holding the wing flat against the surface, insert the servo tray into the space between W6 and W7 and hold the wing flat against the build surface. While making sure that the wing is nice and flat against the table, apply some glue to all of the joints and joins along the top and bottom plywood and balsa main spars, making sure throughout that it remains square and true. You can add glue to all of the joints over the entire wing at this point. Start building the second wing panel by inserting ribs W2 to W11 onto the plywood main spar. Find the other balsa doubler and carefully slot it onto the assembled ribs behind the main spar. Repeat the steps for the first wing panel to create the second half and complete the wing structure. Locate the central rib W1 and insert it into the center slot on the main spar. If the optional extra detail kit has been purchased, at this point insert the 2 wing radiator bases between ribs W2 and W3, making sure they are flush with the lower edges of the ribs and aligned against the trailing edge. We will be showing you in a future video how to assemble these additional aesthetic components along with other upgrades and details. All you need to know for now is to make sure that you have the bases in place for later if you do intend to build your model with these upgrades. Fit the aileron servos like this and run the servo wires back through the holes in the ribs to the centre of the wing. Moving on to the all-important ailerons, find the aileron bases and the leading edge spars. Build the 2 ailerons together to ensure that you have a left and a right hand aileron built. It's really quite easy to accidentally end up building 2 of the same aileron if you're not careful. Dry assemble the leading edge spars onto the aileron bases with the etched dotted line on the spar facing away from the base. Add the aileron ribs and wick some glue to fix all of the parts in place permanently. The leading edge of the ailerons needs to be beveled to allow them to move freely. Stick some masking tape along the etched dotted line covering the lower part of the spar. Take a bit of fine sandpaper and sand the unmasked part of the spar to create a bevel that is flush with the front of the ribs. Remove the tape and apply some more masking tape, this time covering the beveled upper part of the spar along the etched dotted line. Sand a bevel to the same angle as the top. Do this for both ailerons. Gently sand the ailerons to remove any lumps and bumps and to round off the trailing edges. Check that the aileron fits into its slots along the wing and can move freely. If it doesn't, then lightly sand the ends of the ailerons until they can move without interference. The ailerons are now ready to be covered. Once you have all of your parts covered with your chosen covering material and method, make sure to check out our other videos on that subject. Start assembling the fin and rudder. Insert the 2 mylar hinges into the slots cut previously. You'll probably need to cut the covering here to allow you to actually access access the holes that you cut before, and then make sure that you can fit some mylar hinge into this slot. Fit the rudder by inserting the mylar hinges into the slots, and check the rudder is aligned with the fin at about 0.5mm above the fin before wicking some glue into the joint. Gently flex the rudder for a few minutes back and forth while the glue sets to prevent the whole thing sticking together. Cut away the covering material for the control horn on the rudder. Repeat this process for the horizontal stabilizer and elevator, releasing the cuts made earlier, slotting the hinges and wicking glue. Make sure the elevator moves freely. Also, like with the rudder, cut away the covering for the control horn. Now assemble these two sub-assemblies onto the rear of the fuselage, locating the fin tab through the tailplane into the slot on the fuselage. Check that the tailplane is horizontal and that the fin is lined up with the top keel at right angles to the tailplane. Tack the assembly together with small amounts of glue. Check again that everything is lined up square before wicking some more glue into the joints between the tailplane and the fuselage. Now you can find two of the plywood control horns to link up your push rods. You may need to enlarge the holes slightly if using linkages. Leave the linkage loose for now, as you can adjust the controls later and tighten the screw. For the aileron assembly, cut 3 of the mylar hinges in half lengthways, creating 6 hinges, each 10mm wide and 25mm long. Insert the mylar hinges into the slots on the rear wing spars, 3 each side, leaving approximately 12mm exposed. Ensure that they are square with the spar before wicking some CA into the joint between the hinges and the spars. Gently flex the aileron up and down to prevent the aileron sticking to the wing. Repeat the process to assemble the other aileron. Now you can attach the servo push rods for the ailerons. You can use linkages on both the servo arm and the plywood control horn, or you can create a Z-bend like this for the servo arm end. Pass the Z-bend through the servo arm and place it onto the servo. If you've tested them before, the servos should be centered. You might need to enlarge the hole on the plywood control horn to fit the linkage. We recommend using the middle hole for all control horns on the aircraft. As with the tail controls, don't tighten the linkages on the ailerons at this stage, as you'll want to adjust the controls later. Wick glue into the control horns and cut the wire. Remember to put a screw into the servo to hold the arm in place. You can repeat this whole process for the other aileron servo. Carefully trim the vacuum form canopy to fit onto the cockpit. The rear of the canopy fits the former F8. You can of course paint the canopy, which is something I'll be showing you how to do in a future video. Stick the canopy in place using canopy glue or non-fogging cyano glue. For now I'm using some tape so I can remove it for painting later. Do not use ordinary super glue, as this will cause the canopy to fog up. Concerning the exhaust stacks, the early stacks in this kit are from the Mark 1 to Mark 8 Spitfire. Later Spitfire stacks can be found in the additional upgrade extra detail pack. Glue these parts together and sand them into a rounded shape ready for painting. On each side of the Spitfire nose, remove the covering over the square slot for the exhaust and glue the stack in place. Remove the covering from the 4 holes at the front and the rear of the wing saddle. Cut 2 pieces of 1/8 dowel to a length of 4 inches or 100mm and insert them into the holes so that the dowel has an equal amount, about 20mm, on each side of the fuselage. Glue these in place for your elastic wing bands. For the setup, we'll go into setting up your Spitfire in depth in another video, but for now briefly you can install your servo leads and ESC lead with a Y harness to pair the 2 aileron leads together if needed to the correct channels of your chosen receiver. Make sure to refer to your receiver and transmitter manuals to work out which channel is which. It'll be different for whatever transmitter that you're using. With that, your new RC Spitfire is finished and ready for setup and tuning. Thanks for watching this video. Make sure to keep an eye out for a future setup video along with some more videos on detailing and painting your Spitfire. Links to the kit and extra resources can be found in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you on the next one.